Hello and welcome to my first video for 2019. In this video we're going to be looking at how to paint the Warden from the Sepulchral Guard from the expansion for Warhammer Underworlds Shadespire. So on the screen at the minute you can see that he's already been primed with Vallejo surface primer. Obviously it's black, and it was left overnight so the primer's dried properly and is now ready to paint. So in this video we're going to be mainly looking at how to paint the armour and cloak, and the following videos will show you the rest of the model. So starting with the armour, the first paint I'm using is Bugman's Glow. The armour is going to be bronze, and one of the main components of bronze is copper, so you get some of that kind of pinky metal showing through, but then as the process goes on, it'll be toned down a little bit with some oranges and browns, and that also is going to have verdigris on it as well. I'm looking for a very subdued, weathered kind of look for this model. The whole thing's going to be very dull and grimy looking, with a few spot colours just to bring out a bit of interest on it. You can see how I'm applying the paint in a very, very rough way. This is going to help towards the rough look of the armour. I want it to be obviously old and battered, so I don't want really super smooth transitions. I want some of this texture to show through. If you can see on the leg at the moment, I'm going to be highlighting from the bottom of the shin, fading out towards the top, and actually it's going to be just the primer showing through at the top. Now this isn't necessarily completely realistic to a certain extent, because the knee's bent over. It will represent light reflecting off the floor, hitting it from the underside, because you wouldn't get any top-down light. But I'm not too bothered about it being super accurate, but what I am doing is making sure that because it fades out towards black at the top of the knee, then I can put the hard highlight line at the top, so then that works with a nice contrast going light, dark, light. Which will help with the non-metallic metal effect. It's the same kind of idea for the leg that I'm painting now as well. Also, this shoulder section that I just painted, that's wrong. While I was painting the model, I thought that was a shoulder plate, like a spiky shoulder plate, but afterwards when I was looking at it I realised that it's actually the cloak flicking up and round the arm. So yes, don't copy that for painting the armour effect on there. I do actually fix that later on, so in the following videos you'll see that it's no longer this pinky colour. Now I have done kind of bronzy looking colours before, but I'm doing this just to show you that you don't have to use the exact colour combinations that you see all the time. You can just pick colours. You can even mix them yourself really. The main things are that you need the pinks and the oranges and the yellows and the browns, and you can get all sorts of tonal variations and things with those colours. You can mix them together and do whatever you want, as long as you've got a nice transition, because you get different types of bronze as well, and depending on how old it is, how weathered it is, how dirty it is, things like that. So don't just limit yourself to exact colour combinations. Just as long as you get close to them, so you know that it's the right sort of colours for bronze, then you have a lot of leeway within that range of colours. And I'm going to be doing something similar actually in one of the later videos for this, because I've painted some gold sections on, and I did the gold specifically because gold doesn't weather really. It can get dirty, but it doesn't. You don't get anything like verdigris or anything like that, or rust. So it'll stand out quite nicely against the rest of the model, and quite frequently in the previous videos I've used for doing non-metallic gold, I've used Vallejo model colour, Japanese uniform and English uniform for the base colours for the gold, whereas in the following videos for this I'm using just Games Workshop colours. just to show that you can use, you know, similar kind of colours and get a very similar result, even though they're not from the same manufacturer. And just to show that you don't have to use the exact colours that I've used in the video. It's more about how you apply the colour than using the exact same colour. So just looking at how I've applied the Bugman's Glow on the chest, you can see that as I've applied more layers towards the very top, where I want it to be brighter, it's obviously because of the translucency of the paint. As you add more layers, it becomes more opaque, and so it's become very pink. You can see the skin colour there, and that's because that's where the highest point, the light point and the focal point that I want on the model, along with the head as well. What I've done with the way that I applied the layers is it's allowed me to create a very rough sort of looking transition just using one paint and one consistency of paint, just having multiple layers. So now I'm going on to Ratskin Flesh, again in the Games Workshop paint. This is a bit more orange. You can see on the wet palette there in the top left, the Ratskin Flesh is second from the right. Obviously to the right of that is the Bugman's Glow that I used to start with. So it's exactly the same process using the Ratskin Flesh, but this time just focusing in the area a little bit more. Also you can see at the moment where I'm applying the paint, I'm just doing a little bit of secondary reflection on the underside. I guess that would be where the belly is, but that's as high as I really want to go with the secondary reflection. I don't want the secondary reflection to overpower the main reflection on top of the chest. So you can see it's only a very soft highlight, and it doesn't take up that much of the model in comparison to the top-down highlight. If you look at the paintbrush that I'm using, it's actually one of my older paintbrushes. Again, the tip has worn down a little bit. You can tell it's older because it's built up a bit of gunk around the ferrule. But the tip of it as well is not incredibly sharp, because it just helps to get the soft blending, I find, having that softer tip. Whereas, especially because I don't need the sharp marks or anything, I don't need to be incredibly neat. So actually having the softer tip just makes it that little bit easier to get the soft marks down, rather than worrying about getting a hard mark, because obviously I want these to be blended in, and because I can apply the paint roughly and do soft marks, it looks more blended than if I was using a sharper brush. Of course, it does mean that when you get to some of the highlight edges, you might want to switch back to one of your newer brushes, just so you can get those clean marks on. So I actually skipped a step there as well. There are 4 of the main highlight colours for the bronze that I'm using, but actually only 3 paints. So we've covered the Bugman's Glow and the Ratskin Flesh. To the bottom right of these 4 colours, there is Ratskin Flesh mixed 50-50 with Vallejo Ice Yellow, and then the top highlight colour is obviously the Ice Yellow next to it. But I did the 50-50 mix between the two, so that I had a mid-tone step, because if I just went from Ratskin Flesh to Ice Yellow, it would have been too big a tonal jump, and even though I'm trying to apply soft marks for the transitions, it would have still been a really harsh contrast step, so it wouldn't look very smooth on the model. For some of these holes in the breastplate, all I'm doing is just highlighting the lower line. Try and keep the outer shape of it fairly hard, so that you can see. So basically you want it to be defined. And also, you may remember how I was saying about how I was roughly applying the paint. Now these marks are then represented on the chest, and then I've turned them into dints, so you can see one or two kind of dark marks on there that I then highlight the lower section on, and then that is like a painted on 3-dimensional dent rather than the holes and things that are already there that are sculpted on, and it just gives you a little bit more variety, so it represents kind of more shallow damage to the armour. So you can see there is still quite a fairly large tonal jump between the shadow and the highlight area from the Bugman's Glow. But you don't need to worry too much about that, because the glazing that comes later will blend the sections together. I am painting this. This was actually a gift for me, a Christmas gift. The box set was, so I'm painting these to game with, so I'm not overly concerned about it being display quality or anything like that, but I'm trying to paint them reasonably neatly, just because I don't I like to have quite nice looking models to game with, but that does mean that I end up not having many games with painted models. So I'm using now Mournfang Brown in the shadows. This is going to destroy the shadows a little bit, makes them much lighter, but because I'm going to be adding verdigris on, that won't matter too much. But if you find that because Mournfang Brown is a very translucent colour again, you should hopefully still be able to see some of the shadow area. If it goes too dark though, you can just use some Rhinox hide and glaze that into the darkest areas, because what you'll find is when you put the verdigris on, it works much better in the dark areas. But I'm just kind of trying to blend in the shadows a little bit here at the moment. You can see at the bottom of the chest plate how it there's an edge to it that flicks up, and that catches more of the light, which makes sense because it's pointing upwards. And it just creates a nice little bit of contrast for the non-metallic metal effect again. So that can also represent on the secondary reflection at the bottom near the belly how the light would reflect off that edge. Apologies if you can hear a bit of background noise. The washing machine is going. My wife is still off work at the moment, so it's a little bit harder for me to create the videos with a silent house, but hopefully it's not too distracting. One thing you should have picked up on is that I'm not just doing 5 stages using these 5 colours, so it's not just a case of going from dark to light. I'm actually going backwards and forwards between the colours, and also as I mentioned in most of my videos, I'm not always washing the brush off between the steps, so I might go from ice yellow, say, then back to Ratskin flesh, just touching the paint in the Ratskin flesh, and then as it applies to the model, the 2 colours will mix, and it just helps to blend some of the stages together. Or if I want the ice yellow but not quite as harsh as it is there, it allows me to just take the edge off that brightness while still having a highlight. It also allows you to work much quicker because you're not having to wash the brush off all the time, and it allows you to do the quick blends. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this shoulder pad is completely wrong, and you shouldn't paint this as bronze at all. So here you can see I've been and worked over the other areas on the model with exactly the same process that I just showed you on the chest, but I wanted to get the rest of it done so that we can move on to the next stage. You can see here as well that I'm actually using some white. So on the spear I've used exactly the same colours, same process, but I want the spear to be a little bit brighter so it's catching the light more. Also, I realised when I painted it, well, I wasn't sure which way to go, but on the armour on the forearms, it has straps on there. I painted them as bronze at this stage, but I've since decided that I'm going to turn them into leather straps. In the later videos for this, I paint the leather strap around his waist, and I'm going to do exactly the same process on the arms. So because I haven't actually changed them yet, but I just decided while looking at it that it doesn't make that much sense to have them as metal, and it's a bit more interesting to have the change in texture to have leather on the straps. But you still have in the video how to paint the leather belt, so you'll be able to paint it exactly the same way. I also decided later on the trim on the shield will also be painted as bronze, because I decided that it was it didn't make much sense to have bronze armor and then a steel trim on the weapons, because if you make steel, why would you use bronze? But it would also look more interesting possibly to have it as steel, but I've tried to make it work anyway. If you've seen the photograph that I posted advertising this video, you'll see that I think it works alright anyway. But enough of that, onto the the cloak now, because obviously I've been painting that for a little bit now. Again, I'm using an old worn out brush for this, because again I want textures on. Now the textures are a little bit different on the cloak to the texture on the armour, and that's just the different movements I'm doing. So it helps that the cloak is much larger, so you have much more space to do quite expressive large brush strokes. You can see how like the marks are, well, they're huge basically, and I'm just scrubbing them on there. The colours that I'm using are they're all Vallejo greys this time. There's German grey, neutral grey, and cold grey. Now I don't usually use game colour paints. The cold grey is a game colour paint. It does separate on the palette. If you look on the top left, that's cold grey. But I found that it still has a fairly high pigment density. It makes solid marks, so I decided to give it a go anyway. You could use pale blue grey as well, which would have been fine. You could even make your own greys really if you just start with black and just add white in various stages, because I'm going to be glazing over the cloak, so the faint colours that they've got in the cloak don't matter too much. It looks a little bit bluey, but which works nicely against the pinky oranges of the armour, but it's not a major thing really because it's so subtle. And also I'm going to be glazing a kind of a, well, I'm going to be glazing Death Guard green over the cloak, so it will tone down the blue even more. So you can see the marks that I'm making are really, really strong and messy. excuse me, they will be obviously neatened up as we go along, because marks like this aren't really the best looking things, but they work as a good base. So as you apply more and more layers, they kind of the marks build up on top of each other. So now I want on to neutral grey, I think, at this stage. But yeah, it's definitely neutral grey. And if you see how I'm applying it, I'm virtually destroying my brush. So this is also why I say to use an older brush. But if you look how the paint looks on there, it's kind of almost like dry brush. It's kind of a wet dry brush, but it just lets the paint get onto the model in that sort of chaotic. I've mentioned this before. I call it controlled chaos. So you don't have complete control over the marks that you're making, but you do have a rough control, because obviously you're controlling the brush. But as I said, this does mess up your brushes a little bit. So always use old or worn out brushes for this kind of thing. Don't use your brand new brushes, because it'll destroy the tip of them straight away. Now if you look at the positions that I've used for the highlights on the cloak, you can see that the highlights go around the spear, so that it's shading going down into the crevice, and then there's a transition going from black to grey coming out of it again, and then by the time I've finished, the end of the cloak will be even lighter. So this works in two ways. One, it gives highlights and definition to the shape of the cloak. It gives it a bit of a dimension to it as well, so it's not just a flat piece of material. It does actually look like it's curving, and also it'll look worn and dirty, and part of that dirt will again be the Death Guard green when that gets applied. So here, this is where I'm using the cold grey, and it's just exactly the same process I've already been doing. Scrub the paint on, paying attention to the highlight points, but again, it's in a smaller area. It's always putting the highlights into smaller areas, so you still get the previous layers of paint working as a transition. I've also got some Vallejo model colour black on the palette there at the bottom, and that just allows me to blend in some of the colours if I feel like the contrast has gone too high in areas, things like that. You can see here this cold grey, how I'm applying it to the end of the cloak more. It looks very high contrast as I'm applying it, but when it dries, it does soften down a little bit as well. I've mentioned this as well before in videos, but just to go over it again, lighter colours tend to be very bright when you apply them, and then they dull down. So if you want something on a model to be very bright and you're painting over a dark area, then you will need to give multiple coats. It might look fine when you're just applying it, but then it will just dull down afterwards, because the water has evaporated out of the paint, and then you can see the well, it gives it, so it's a thinner layer basically because of the evaporation. So now I'm using a newer brush. You can tell one because the point of the brush is now sharper, and it doesn't have the grime around the ferrule. But what I'm doing now is just doing some refined marks. I'm neatening up the highlights at the top sections of the creases and things like that, but also just going to painting some neater, I don't want to call them scratches. I really hate it when I see on material where people put scratches like it's armour, because you don't really get scratches on material. as such. Well, maybe leather you do, but it's more like scuffs and holes and worn marks and things like that. All these sharp lines that are highlighted up like it's armour looks very strange. I think when I see people paint like that on material, but or clothing material anyway. Having said that, it really does depend on the look and style that you're going for. So in some circumstances, it probably is quite suitable to do that. If that's the look for the whole model you're going for, like you have a very stylized look or whatever, and that's what you want to achieve. But for a more realistic look, then don't put hard lines, scratches on fabrics. So here you can see that I'm just I'm putting kind of texture onto the cloak with these very tiny little squiggly bits, and this works for adding detail, makes it look more kind of like a dirty material as well, like a bit worn and things, but it also helps to work with the transition. So the transition is softened in, not by transparency, but by using the marks. The marks spread out more, so it's kind of like you're tricking the eye. It's not a blended paint, but just because it's lots of small marks, it's kind of like if you imagine pointillism. Now, with pointillism, you're always doing the same heaviness of the mark. So if you want a more opaque color, color, then or tone, then you do lots of dots close together. Then the more that you want it to spread out, you do the dots further away. And it's exactly the same with these marks. You're using the same tone, but you're just spreading it out more, so it makes it look like a transition. And with the different layers of the paint as well, even though the top layers are more refined, it's still multiple layers spreading out more, because they're on top of each other with the different colours. It just helps to blend it all in. I hope all that makes sense. So look for the highlights. Again, there's the trick where you can hold it under a lamp. Of course, it depends on the angle that you use, but like you can tilt it a little bit and you'll get different light areas on the model that catch the light. But generally speaking, if you want the top-down light, just roughly hold the model under the lamp. It gives you a good idea on where to put light placement for the primary light at least. But also just pay attention to where you want focal points to be, and just pick out interesting parts on the model. Now, obviously, you want the top half to be the main focal point. So that's why the top of the cloak is highlighted more than the bottom of the cloak. But there's a little section at the bottom where there's a kind of fold where I've put some more highlights, and it just allows you to draw your eye down that little section, and doesn't mean that the bottom of the cloak just completely vanishes out of sight and has no visual interest. But the only reason I could do that was because of that upwards fold on the cloak. If it wasn't there, then you couldn't do something like that. So here you can see what I was talking about more with those lots of little marks. They're not super well blended in, but because I'm going to glaze on top of them, it's going to have the same effect as to soften them out a little bit. But this gives kind of a worn texture to the end of the cloak. You can already see with the sculpting that they've put holes in the cloak and it's all torn at the edges and things. So this just kind of enhances that look. So here I'm using the white. You want to be quite careful with using the white because it's that's as high as obviously you can go with the highlight. And if you do these other sections too bright with your highlights, then it's going to draw the eye away from the main focal point on the model. but for the just picking out the edges and things, it just allows them to stand out that bit more against the textures that you've put on. Now here I'm just going back with some of the darker tones of the greys, blending in these textures a bit, so you can still see they stand out an awful lot on the cloak at the moment. But it does, just before I cover them up, it does give you the opportunity to see how the marks actually look on the model. So they're almost a swirly pattern, but fairly randomized. As I said, I was trying to scrunch the brush up so it gives random marks on there. And when you're applying the smaller refined marks, you have to kind of wiggle your hands in multiple directions and things. The thing that you really don't want to do is do lots of marks in the same direction, because it'll become a very obvious pattern, and the human eye is really good at picking up patterns and things. So you're trying to make that or disguise that as much as you can. Because the problem is, when you've got to do a lot of these marks, you're very tempted to do patterns, just because sometimes it can be boring, or you just get into like a this sort of mode where you're putting these marks down over and over, and it just because you're trying to refine and speed up the process as you go along, then you could find yourself doing regular patterns over and over. So you have to constantly remind yourself not to do that. So there you can see the cloak was very roughly all greyed in, and now we're going to glaze some paint on top. This will add a colour tone, a colour tint to it, and it will also blend the pattern, the textures in a bit more, so they're not quite as obnoxious to look at. I have put two paints on there. There is Abaddon Black and Death Guard Green. I actually don't end up using too much Abaddon Black. What I was considering was that if I put too much glaze on and it goes into the recesses, that it could take away some of the shadows. But I was fairly careful how I apply the glaze, and it ended up that I didn't really need to do that. So it's handy to have there just in case, and if you decide that you want some more shadowed areas on, or just to emphasize some of the creases a bit more. But in this case I ended up not having to do that. As usual, the mix for a glaze is as much as you want it to be. The thinner the glaze, the smoother the transition, but the more coats you have to do. There's no set when someone says a glaze, there's no set mixture or ratio for the paint and water. And of course you can use other mediums as well. I'm not really interested in using other mediums. I don't see the need for them. You can do a glaze perfectly fine just using water, and it doesn't have to be distilled water either. I've read all sorts of strange things about people saying that you need to use pure distilled water for glazes. It really doesn't make that much of an impact. But yes, the Death Guard Green in this case is somewhere between 5 and 7 parts water to paint. But as I say, always test these things. If the mark that you make is too strong, add more water. If it's not strong enough, add more paint. You can glaze with the paint a little bit thicker to start with if you find that it's taking a long time and you're getting bored. But just be careful, because you can get into the habit of putting the layers down, and then you've kind of like, I've just made an opaque colour and completely wiped out all the underpainting that I've done. So you can't go wrong by adding too much water it'll just take a lot longer if you add too much water. But there you can see the cloak that I've basically just glazed and glazed over using the Death Guard green, and it's now gone kind of a dirty green colour, so it looks older and worn. Now I'm going to be doing the verdigris on the armour. For that I'm just using Sotek green. People have been a little bit confused when they see the photo, because they say that they want to know what blue colour I'm using, and the description is that it's a green colour. Verdigris is supposed to be green. Quite often people use blues for it. If you actually use reference for verdigris, it's even more green than this. I actually quite often find that something like Cyberite green makes a really good verdigris if you add a bit of white to it. But in this case, I like the very blue green because it just works better for the colour contrast. It works better against the armour, and also because I've got the green tint on the cloak, then I don't want the verdigris to be too green as well, because it just ends up clashing then. I'm applying the Sotek green as a glaze, and I'm mainly working in the shadows, and I'm using it to glaze some of the sections together. So again, it's doing exactly what I just did on the cloak, and it softens some of the textures and things. So when I was saying before about the Bugman's glow, how I was scuffing on the paint, and I was like, don't worry too much, because between the shadows of that, now obviously there was some Mournfang brown on there as well, but it was still quite a harsh step. But with this glazing over it, it's really softened that step down now. But so focusing it in the shadows just helps it stand out. But also, you don't want to go over the highlight areas too much, because one, it'll tone them down. You want the highlight areas to stand out, to be shiny. So it's not realistic again, because if something has a lot of verdigris on, unless it's been polished and just left the verdigris in the recesses, which again is quite a nice look. But if you just left, say, like a copper or bronze bit of jewellery or whatever out in the rain, and it's got verdigris on, the whole thing goes this kind of greeny, light pastely greeny colour. So from a purely realistic point of view, the verdigris would cover all of the armour and it wouldn't be shiny. But sometimes if you look for reference online, you'll see that especially with things like copper buckets and things like that, it'll have verdigris in all the recesses where so the bucket's been cleaned, and then it looks shiny. But it's a very artificial look. So I don't think an undead warrior would really be polishing his armour too much. But it looks nice on the model, and I think it still works well, having a little making it a bit more interesting, and allowing that shine to look on the armour. We're getting towards the end of the video, so I just want to mention as well, because you can see on the finished model that I've painted the Sotek green into all the dents on the armour as well. I did it using the glaze, but that's a bad idea, because you just have to do lots of layers. So I'd add a bit more paint to it, so it's basically just normal thinned down paint, and then you paint that into the recesses, and then if you add a small amount of white to the very centre, but only a very small, it just makes it a more concentrated amount of verdigris. So there on the photo you can see what I'm talking about, where I've just painted in those holes. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it.